you're just kind of stuck in this cycle where we have to figure out how do we encourage private sector involvement so that we can produce and we can create more value versus the current method of getting a lot of debt, getting a lot of economic aid.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Welcome back to the podcast Learniverse, a program designed to educate people on diverse range of content. I'm your host Ruhan Ahmed, joining you from the studios of MTA International Gambia. And today we are having with us in the studio who is an experienced financial professional, and he is Sir Modou Jobe. Welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much, Rohan, for having me in the studio, for hosting us as well. Appreciate being here today.
No, it's a pleasure. And, this podcast is going to circulate around discussing the economy of the country, that is the Gambia. So in context to that, I want to start with the first question, that what are the key reasons that the country economic health is significant?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. And greetings to all the listeners and those of us watching us at the podcast as well. So, economic health determines, the level of employment, the level of investment, job creation within an economy. We would generally measure those by factors of GDP, debt to GDP, employment, inflation. But, those are very general. I think we kind of have to look at, in this case, more sort of like currency stability, things that are kind of affecting the everyday consumers within the region and within the country specifically. I think those are a much better measure to see what the health of the economy is. And obviously, economic health attracts investments, right? In turn, it increases your tax base, and in turn, those proceeds can go towards improving the livelihoods and the living standards of those within the community. For Gambia specifically, there are some challenges, right? We're vulnerable because we are very import dependent. For instance, in 2023, the export value of the country was $85 million and the import value was $2.5 billion. So we're importing 25 times more than we export. That creates many different challenges, which is why there has to be this focus on industrialization and domestic production. And so I know we would sort of touch on some of those ideas later on how we would do that. But if you also, to accomplish that, there's some things we have to address, because the country is sort of, in danger of becoming a welfare state. And I say that because, we receive $200 to $300 million in economic development a year. At the same time, 40% of our GDP is from remittances. The value is 40% of GDP of remittances, of people in the diaspora sending, money back home. And unfortunately, a lot of that money goes towards, sort of like the Maslow hierarchy of needs, like shelter and food. And again, those things are primarily imported, right? So you're just kind of stuck in this cycle where we have to figure out how do we encourage private sector involvement so that we can produce and we can create more value versus the current method of getting a lot of debt, getting a lot of economic aid. And on top of that, almost 40% value of GDP is people sending money back home. And how do we steer that money into investments as well? So that's sort of where we are. But the economic health is very important because it is what's going to attract investors.
So, just in connection to that, many African countries, they're struggling with this high level of debt. And according to the report from 2023, it says that about half of African nations, they had debt to GDP of about 60% of their income. And when looking at the Gambia, it says 75%, which is quite huge. So, okay, but before even we move on with this, look into the answer of this question, uh, can you simplify, for the listeners in simple terms, like what does this debt has to do with GDP and all that?
Yeah. So, in sort of like in the Western world, right, you can just look at it from, it's like your credit score almost, right? So the level of debt you have and the amount of gross domestic product that your country actually generates, right? The higher it is, obviously, it's not good. That means, that's your income almost, and this is the debt you carry, right? So it's, you need to manage it because you have to service the debt, right? And so you're talking more broadly with African countries. The problem is this debt, they come with so many conditions, right? On top of that, they come with very high interest rates, right? And so what ends up happening is the governments are already running budget deficits, right? And so they're struggling with, how do I pay this debt? It becomes this sort of self-fulfilling cycle where they have to print more money, right, to service the debt, because they can't service the debt because the rates are too high, right? And what that ends up doing is it also promotes inflation, because now you're printing more money, right? And so now the currency is devaluing, right? And so that has an effect on the economy and GDP down the road, right? Because now your purchasing power as a citizen of that country goes down as well. So it's just this vicious cycle. The more debt you have, the more debt service you have to, pay for at the end of the month, quarter, whatever, right? On top of that, you're running a budget deficit, so now you're printing more money, right? Weakening your currency, right? And then next month you have to print more money. So it's like just this vicious cycle. The higher the debt load, the more debt service you have, which just kind of weakens your economy generally. And down the line, you can't borrow anymore because it's too much debt, and the debt holders realize you can't pay it. But to your point though, there's a bigger problem, which is there's a lot of capital in the world, right? And Africa is very attractive because you can get very attractive rates, and so it's a two-way street problem. African leaders have a high appetite for debt, and the rest of the world are very happy to give them the debt, right? And I think even more problematic is, what is that debt being go to fund or finance? And we can get into that, but that's the bigger issue is, where's that debt going? What are these governments putting it into?
So, like coming back to the question again, now Gambia, such a small country having such a massive debt. So, it's definitely a very terrific condition. So, what is the way forward? What are the steps that can be taken?
Yeah, so it's difficult because the government struggles with a tax base. And this problem is simple if you really think about it. And the issue the government has a challenge with the tax base is that we don't have enough private sector involvement in our economy, right? If you have a very robust private sector, right, you will have a large enough tax base, right? And so, from tax collection alone, you can self-finance a lot of the infrastructure projects they want to do. And Gambia is at 75%, but it's important to also realize that in 2016, right, it was only 60%, right? And now it's 75%. So it's increased tremendously in just 9 years or so, right? And so we need to kind of evaluate also, where is that money being spent? Now, we've been building a lot of roads in the country, and everyone's very excited because for so long the roads have been so terrible, right? And obviously that kind of infrastructure has value, but it's not an income generating investment, right? is very short-term in nature. It's very quick to build roads. It's very easy to be like, hey, look, I built a road, right? But it's not income generating. Like you build a road, yes, we get to use it. Yes, it's easier, like maintenance-wise, and these more difficult, nuanced things to measure. But we have a big energy problem, right? So what is that debt going to? It's equally as important as how much the debt is, right? Energy infrastructure is a big problem for the private sector to thrive in this country, and for Gambia to industrialize. Energy cost has to go down significantly, right? For instance, poultry is like a high consumption product here, but poultry processing requires a lot of energy. So if you talk to people in that industry, they'll say it's easier to import it from Brazil. It's much cheaper because you'll spend so much energy to process the poultry versus the cheaper imports, which is why we import everything. It's just easier and cheaper to import than it is to domestically do anything. So we have to be mindful of where that money is going, right? That it is going into these income generating, more productive areas of our economy versus a shiny new road. So I think that's one area we have to be mindful of. And I think also we say 60 to 75% in Gambia, for instance, that debt is much higher. It's much higher than the actual number. In Senegal, like recently when they had a turnover of government, they found all these secret debt, right? Because in most of the countries, the president or the cabinet is allowed to take out these debts and they don't have to tell anyone, right? Yeah. So these are all very problematic for the area. But I think the main thing is we need to understand the consequence of debt, that vicious cycle I talked about, of the debt servicing, of the printing of the money, the devaluing of the currency, the inflation, right? Like we need to understand those consequences, but also we need to make sure it's going in the right areas.
Yeah. So, you also touched on introducing private sectors. Mm-hmm. So what are the steps that we need to take as a nation to attract private sectors in the country?
Yeah. So, I think there's a few things, right? So even for myself, for instance, I left Gambia as a very young age, grew up in the States, and I said, you know what, I want to go back. I want to invest in Gambia, which is why I'm here, right? So I think to encourage private sector, there are several things we have to do. Primarily, if you look at things like the ease of doing business, we're ranked 155 in the world, right? So it's very difficult, right, to open a business, to register it, to get permits, right? Dispute resolution, cost of capital is high. So for us to do those things have to be in place. I already talked about like the energy issue. Like that's a major hindrance, like to want to come build any kind of industrial base, right? Because you're going to pay more than you will in Senegal or in anywhere in the region for energy, right? But also we need to create the environment for entrepreneurs to thrive, right? And part of that is to make it easier to do business. The other thing is also this competition environment, right? The Gambia Constitution created something called the GCCPC, which is the Gambia Consumer and Competition Protection Commission, who really sounds like it is what it sounds like. It's a consumer and competition mechanism. However, one, they're under the Ministry of Trade, so they're not an independent entity. But two, they have no enforcement mechanism, right? And it's done by intention. So say you have money and you want to come invest in Gambia, right? You want to have several things. One is property rights and protection, right? A way to handle dispute resolution, right? So just some of those basic things need to be in place, right? The banking infrastructure needs to be more robust than it is today. I think it's come a long way from where it was, but that needs to be more robust, right? And I think we need to make sure people know we're open for business, and whatever that is, whatever that program is. We have some programs, like the special investment certificate, which allows you to, make a certain investment and it's tax free. But we need to figure out how to encourage that capital to come by making it easy to do business, by making sure we can protect people's assets. Those things have to be key. But also, as I was saying with GCCPC, we need to ensure a fair marketplace. I mean, as an entrepreneur myself, a lot of what I see is there's a lot of favoritism within the economy. Either one person dominates a sector. It is by design, right? And so how do you have that free market, free and open market, free and fair market that would encourage people to come in, whether they have asset protection, that's another one. And we need to work on the cost of capital because it's very high here in this country. If you go take out a loan from a bank, you're talking at least 15%, right? And that's very difficult as a business owner, so you just have to add that to your costs, and then your risk-adjusted return is significantly lower. So those are things we have to be mindful of. Energy infrastructure for sure. We need to work on the ease to do business in this country. We need to have a fair and free market, right? These are some of the things we can work on immediately to encourage more private sector investment.
Thank you for highlighting these points. And what do you think? What are the possible steps that can be taken in order to boost domestic productivity in the country?
Yeah, I think some of those we kind of touched on a little bit, but I think the biggest one is private sector growth, right? I think that's a critical one. We have a lot of public sector investment, and I always kid that there is not a worse investor than governments, right? Private sector investment is critical because if it doesn't work, you've lost a lot, right? Whereas public sector investment, sometimes there's a lot of waste, right? And they're politically motivated sometimes, right? But private sector investors will find other investors to bring to the table, right? And then, the other one is what we talked about in terms of focusing on income generating investments, right? Agro-processing, it's a big thing that we should focus on, manufacturing, and then sort of that energy infrastructure. But the other ones are tackling the roadblocks that make it difficult to do business in Gambia as well. So I think those things will sort of help drive more domestic productivity. Okay. Yeah. We also exported a lot of raw agricultural products, right? We are not processing them, right? And so if you look at it, you're getting, when you export it raw, you didn't do any value add. You're getting less than 10% of the actual end value, right? So you need to focus on building more agro-processing, right?